Let's see what do we have for learning today. We just completed 14 chapters of this book. The name of this book is The Vedic Age. It was written by R.C. Majumdar. Um, if I'm not wrong, there are 8 or 9 books in this entire series. The exact name of the book is The History and Culture of the Indian People. Okay. But for reasons that I have explained already in the previous videos of this channel, is I do not subscribe to this name, that is India, because for me it is a derogatory term that people from the monotheistic tradition, they use this word, that is India, to look down upon us, to look down on the pagan people. Okay, because it was something that they used to denote to the lands where the message of Jesus Christ had not spread. All right, so the next time you call yourself Indian, keep in mind you are merely calling yourself as a pagan who has not yet been converted, and it is the responsibility of the white person to convert you. Hence they called you Indian. All right, and again, you don't have to take my word for it. You can do your own due diligence and come back to this video and comment on it if there is a rebuttal to that. Now I know there might be some of you out there who will say that what is the point of it? Let us just continue with the word that is Indian and the identity that is Indian. There is everything that is wrong with it. Once you adopt the identity that somebody else has given you, okay, that starts a downward spiral of agreement with everything that the person who has given you the identity says. Okay, now that you've adopted their identity, now with such adoption of that identity comes the baggage of the scholarship, that they will tell you, okay, since you are this, okay, this is what you have been, this is what you have to be, and this is what you have to aspire to be. And hence you see the increasing westernization and hence you see increasing westernization and wokery in our current generation. Okay, so yes, it is very important to reclaim your real identity. It is very important to reclaim the rightful history that we have. And that is the whole point of multiple series. One of them is already done, that is Unlearning the Falsehoods. You can find it in the playlist sections of it. There are close to 40 episodes in which we have traced the contemporary history of Bharat from 1700s to 1947, when there was transfer of power. Okay. Now we are focusing on the ancient history, and we have already established how the Aryan invasion theory was incorrect, and you don't have to take my word for it. You can do your own due diligence, and there are also multiple scholars out there who have disapproved this theory of Aryan migration. It was simply just crafted and created to create this narrative of the natives of Bharat being somehow racially inferior to the people of the West. Okay, so when they came over here and they saw that there is an existing civilization, a settlement that has evolved ways, evolved means of handling their politics, handling civic authority, handling their dissemination of knowledge, their arts and craft. When they came over here, they were completely appalled as to how can a civilization so far away from us exists that is superior and way ahead in terms of development in every realm of human endeavor possible. Okay, so they had to come up with this idea of, okay, this civilization over here is definitely the epitome of human development in whatever realm of human endeavor possible, be it intellectual, be it physical, be it spiritual. But there is some contribution from the side of the West as well, and hence they had to craft this Aryan migration theory, that the original homeland, okay, this culture that has come up in the areas of current day Pakistan and Afghanistan, okay, they might have come up over there, but the original forefathers that established or that birthed this civilization did not were not native to this land. They came from outside, and hence they could stake some claim and legitimize and justify their claims of racial superiority. Because keep in mind, when the British they came over here, they weren't exactly too many in numbers. All right, all they had to do was intellectually subjugate, because we as a race, we are, I would argue, we are more on the intellectual side. That does not mean that I'm taking anything away from the martial side of our civilization. Definitely, there is a martial side to this civilization, but largely our civilization is intellectual. Okay, we worship knowledge, although we worship everything, but we worship knowledge slightly a little bit more. Okay, but again, maybe in some other video we can speak at length on these things. Today we are going to focus on chapter number 15. The title of that chapter in this book is From the Accession of Parikshit to the End of the Barhadrat Dynasty. All right, so just to give you a reference, a brief recap, to give you a sense of the time scale about which we will be talking. Okay, currently it is 2024. Rewind that clock back 2024 years, so we'll reach a point where you will reach a point that is 0. Okay, then again rewind the clock back a millennia, that is 1000 years. That is when the great war of the Bharatas that we call Mahabharat ended. Right now, after the end of Mahabharat, obviously there was widespread destruction. Okay, the scale of the war was such that many of the lineages, many of the tribes, they vanished. Okay, and they have vanished completely, because not all the tribes and not all the lineages find their mention in the Rig Samhita. Okay, um, I have mentioned this in the previous video that Rig Samhita is largely a collection of hymns, a sacrificial hymns. It's not exactly a historical source. Okay, but there can be some sort of historical data and historical facts that can be extracted from the hymns of Rigved. Okay, based on the geography and based on the people who perform those sacrifices. Okay, there are other scriptures, Aryan scriptures, that are pretty much useful when it comes to securing the history from these sources. One such sources are the Brahmanas and the Smritis. Okay, when I say or when I use the word Brahmanas, I mean the commentary upon the Samhitas that were written by the scholars at that time. All right. So after the end of the great war of the Bharatas, ends the Dwapar Yuga and begins the Kali Yuga, that is the age of the Kali. That begins with the accession of Parikshit. Okay, Parikshit was the grandson of Arjun. Okay, the famous archer Pandav that we have discussed. Now he was on the throne, Parikshit, and that is where from Parikshit starts all the other tribes and lineages of the Kali age. Okay, we are operating under the assumption that there was a widespread, destruction on a gregarious scale. Okay, I don't think many of the people would have survived. All right, but yes, from the Kali Yuga onwards, and on the very first line of this chapter, R.C. Majumdar mentions that the Puranas have preserved a list of the kingdoms that flourished at the end of the Bharata war and continued till they were all absorbed by the great Nanda empire of Magad in the 4th century BC. Okay, so starting from the Kali Yuga, okay, that is 1000 years before that 0, if we rewind the clock back 2024 years. Okay, so from that towards the point of 4th century, okay, there is this lack of evidences. And when I speak lack of evidences, I mean actual physical evidence, because literary evidence do exist. Because these lineages, for somebody who is writing Puranas, it is absurd to imagine that that person would have thought of these names. These are all imaginary names. These dynasties, these kings, and these individuals and these lineages did not exist. And whatever that has been written in the Puranas is absolute and utter fiction. All right. Like I mentioned in my previous videos, we can walk down this road only if there is a, you know, if we meet halfway. Meaning, if there is a person out there who is operating under the assumption that everything that has been mentioned in the Puranas is absolute and complete fiction, then that person is a useful and a wokeful idiot. Okay? But if you are willing to meet me halfway, meaning if you are willing to concede that yes, there is some degree of exaggeration, but at the same time, there is also a certain degree of truth as well over here. Okay, then these things will make sense. You cannot just completely neglect the entire historicity that has been mentioned in the Puranas, because it would be absurd for us to imagine that the writers of the Puranas will, imagine up all these names. Because believe me when I say that in the Puranas there are more than 100 dynasties, more than 100 names of specific kings that have been mentioned. R.C. Majumdar mentions it in his book. If you want to do a detailed study, okay, you can buy this book. It is available on Amazon. But yes, on the very first line, he has said the Puranas have preserved a list of the kingdoms that have flourished at the end of the Bharata war and continued till they were all absorbed by the great Nanda Empire of Magad in the 4th century BC. So, when I say 4th century BC, I am talking about the time that is, rewind the clock back 2024 years, and again from zero go back again 4 years, that is 4th century BC. So from that point forwards we have physical evidence for Nanda dynasty. So up until now we were completely operating under the speculations and hypotheses that were formed by the white scholars, and we have already established that these white scholars had the incentive of establishing their own racial superiority by whatever means that is possible to prolong their rule over the colony that was Bharat. All right, so let's focus on this. So the first lineage that R.C. Majumdar mentions is the Pauravas. The first Paurava king, Parikshit, son of Abhimanyu, grandson of Arjun. The Kuru kingdom over which Parikshit ruled extended from the Saraswati to the Ganga according to the epic tradition. It corresponded to modern Thanesar, Delhi, and the upper Gangetic Doab. So if you had to determine the actual geographical boundaries of the Kuru kingdom, which was ruled by Parikshit, it extended from Saraswati to Ganga. Saraswati is an extinct river in the current era, but that does not mean that it did not exist during the days that we are talking about right now. And there are also bits and pockets of Saraswati river that exists in form of a puddle here and there, because it's very old. It's a very antique river, and it has not survived due to the vicissitudes of geographical movements. But yes, so the Kuru kingdom, in its it largely coincides with the current day Thanesar that is in Delhi. All right. Now here on page number 325, R.C. Majumdar, he writes, this is very interesting. Let's see what we can extract from this paragraph that he has written. Puranas are said to have been recited for the first time in the 12-year sacrifice in the Naimisharanya forest on the river Gomti in Ayodhya. Sonaka officiated as the head sacrificer, and to him were recited the Mahabharata and the Puranas as handed down by the Sutas. Okay, so there was an individual who goes by the name of Sonak. He was the one who was an officiator, or he was officiating the sacrifices that were done on the banks of river Gomti in Ayodhya. Okay, so the Puranas mention this. There was the practice of sacrificing animals, okay, in Ayodhya on the banks of river Gomti, and the priest named Sonaka, he was the one who was officiating it. Okay, now he was the one who was the recipient of the recitation of the great epics of the Mahabharata and the Puranas as handed down by the Sutas. Okay, now let's do a thought experiment. Okay, if somebody is narrating these episodes and these epics to Sonak, okay, and they are parallelly narrating these things, okay, so how far back in time would these events would have occurred? That is something for you to imagine and think. Okay, for example, if right now I am narrating something to you, so obviously if there are both the events, okay, let's say I'm narrating you the 2011 World Cup match between Bharat and Sri Lanka, okay, and at the same time I'm also narrating um, another World Cup that has taken place very recently, another uh, Bharat Bangladesh T20 series that is currently going on. Okay, if I am narrating these both things to you at the same time, what does that say about the time scales? Absolutely nothing. Okay, we cannot conclusively assert that, okay, that which one was prior and which one was post. Okay, so these both the epics, Mahabharat and the Puranas, everything was being narrated simultaneously. So we have no conclusive way to determine how far back in time before that narration would those epics been actual lived reality. All right, there are also people out there who will question that how can we objectively determine whether it was an a lived reality or not. Okay, that is where your faith in this civilization comes in. Okay, because there are people in the west who believe that the Lord was resurrected from the dead. There are people in the West Asian region who believe that horses can fly. So why not believe that there were people long way back in time who fought these wars? That is where you are standing at two crossroads. Okay, that is, again, I will leave it to your better judgment. I'm not here to tell you what you should believe. I'm simply just pointing out the anomalies. Whereas, like, the people in the West will tell you something to believe, whereas they believe something that is completely at crossroads with the logic on which they tell you what to believe. Okay. Thus, there seems to have been a collection and edition of traditional accounts for the first time on the occasion of Nemisha sacrifice. The lists of dynasties and kings that subsequently ruled were recorded in future tense as if they were prophecies. There is also, if you sit and analyze the languages of the Puranas, it says that the lists of the dynasties and the kings, the chronology of the kings in the Puranas, if you look at them, they are mentioned in future tenses. So as if it were like prophecies. Okay. It could be I would say it could be an inadequacy on our part to understand the language that is written. But it's written over here, and R.C. Majumdar seems to buy into that opinion that the list of dynasties that were mentioned in the Puranas are written in the future tense. Okay. The capital Hastinapur was washed away by the Ganges or Ganga. Don't say Ganges, it is Ganga. The capital Hastinapur was washed away by locusts. Mentioned in the Chandogya Upanishad is also possibly to be referred to this period. Okay, so Chandogya Upanishad also mentions that there was a place that goes by the name of Hastinapur, and that place was flooded by locusts, and hence there was this terrible mass event that forced people to die and migrate to other places. Okay, so that capital was Hastinapur. So again, like I said, this is where your faith in this civilization comes in. Okay, is it utter fiction? The authors of Upanishad who just randomly thought about the name of the place Hastinapur, randomly came up with this theory that there was a storm, that locust storm. Okay, that is, like I said, that is where again your faith comes in. Right. Next up is the Kosalas. The Puranas, they also give a list of 31 Ikshvaku kings of Kosalas. Okay, Ikshvaku was a dynasty. We have learned that the dynasty has its origins in Ayodhya. Okay, the Solar dynasty of Ayodhya. Okay, frequent wars between the neighboring kingdoms of Kosala and Kashi, and there was continued rivalry for supremacy between them. The Puranas, they also mentioned that the towns of Kosala and Kasi is, yes, Banaras as we know it today. So these towns had frequent rivalry between each other, frequent wars between each other, and there was this, I would say, a profound rivalry between them. Okay, so yes, that again makes you want to wonder what might have been the reason for rivalry. Okay, because there were multiple sets of reason why kings in those days, the Aryan kings in those days, fought with each other. Okay, largely it was restoration of the cosmic order that we like to call as dharma, but there can be multiple other reasons as well. So the Puranas mention, yes, that there were frequent wars between Kosal and Kashi. Though the Kashis appear to have succeeded in the beginning, the final victory went to the Kosalas. R.C. Majumdar mentions that the Kosalas managed to get the better of the people of Kashi and managed to, take over Kashi. The Mahaselva Jataka brings out the third stage in which the Kosala king took advantage of the good nature and religious tendencies of the Kasi king and invaded the neighboring kingdom. Okay, now such has been the pattern of history of uh, multiple traditions and settlements all across this world. Okay, there are people out there, and when I say people, I don't mean the commoners or the lay persons. There are scholars out there, so-called well distinguished scholars out there who will use these frequent rivalries between frequent internal rivalries between such kingdoms as a reason to justify that no, Bharat is not one nation. If indeed they were one nation, why were these two kings fighting? Internal struggle is human nature. Okay, internal rivalries between two kingdoms is human nature. You don't need to use that as a justification to say that no, Bharat as a nation did not exist. All right. Next up, the other kingdoms. We have also discussed Kosal. Another kingdom was Magad. Magad, yes. Magad as a kingdom coincided with the current day Bihar and certain areas of Jharkhand. Now there are from this point forwards, okay, from 4th century forwards, 4th century, 3rd century, 2nd century, 1st century, 0, and then 1, 2, 3 AD, and then 2024 year forwards. That is the current time. Okay, this is the time scale to give you a brief idea. So Magad existed. Yes, there is physical existence available for Magad as well. Okay, Kosala, Vatsa. There is also another kingdom, Panchala kingdom. Okay, the total number of whose, okay, beginning from the west, we have the Panchala kingdom. The total number of whose rulers from the Bharat war up to Mahapadmananda is given as 27 in the Puranas, though no names are mentioned. All right. The Aitreya Brahmana, meaning the scripture, not the Varna Brahmana, the scripture Aitreya Brahmana represents Durmukha as universal monarch who made extensive conquests in every direction and was anointed Brihadupta. Okay. To the south lay Avanti. Avanti roughly corresponds to central Malwa, Nimar, and the adjoining parts of central provinces. The capital of the state was known as Avanti or Ujjaini, identified with modern Ujjain on Sipra, a tributary of the Chambal. Okay, so all these names they find mention to the south. Okay, so here if you imagine that is Bihar, so there was Magad, then there was Ayodhya, Kosal, then there is Kashi, and now further towards south there is Avanti, and the capital of Avanti was Ujjaini, that we today like to call as Ujjain. So these places have been mentioned almost, let's say, Now, if you rewind 2024 years zero and again rewind 4 years back, that is 4th century BC. So these names have been mentioned. So it is almost 3000 years older, these towns. Okay. Now, who's to say that these developments did not come up, on its own? Do you think it is a coincidence that one of the Jyotirlings is there in Ujjain? Do you think there is some reason? Forget the stories, okay? There are some folk stories as well. Okay, let's for the time being ignore those folk tales about the reasonings why each Jyotirling is located as at the place there is. Okay, forget that for a moment. Now, these places have been mentioned 3000 years ago. Okay, now people who lived 3000 years ago at these places, don't you think they would have worshipped the Jyotirling that is located over there? Okay, now how far before we find mention of this place Ujjain did that place exist? Okay, now even if it started existed, let's say 200 years prior to we find the mention, how far before that, the era of trial and error to perfect the sciences and everything would have existed? This is again for you to think. Nothing comes up randomly on its own. Okay, there is a reasonable explanation for everything. It is just a matter of time and patience. And willingness? Are you willing to accept what comes out as a truth? Because to most of you, when you sit down and research and when the truth comes out, it's rather uncomfortable for you, and hence you conveniently choose to brush it under the carpet simply because it does not suit your political narrative. Okay, yes. Ujjaini was very important city in ancient Bharat, both politically and commercially. And it is rather strange that the rulers of so famous a city have not been directly mentioned in the Puranic accounts. It is probable, however, that the 28 Hehiyas, the descendants of the Yadu, who are said to have ruled after the Bharata war, were really the rulers of Avanti. Now there is a conspicuous absence of the rulers of Ujjaini. Who exactly ruled over Ujjain? We don't know. Why? Because it's absent from the Puranas. So simply because it is not mentioned in the Puranas, are we supposed to assume that there were no rulers? That is again, I would say, because this is what is history. When you reconstruct ancient history, there are no conclusive evidences. There are times when you'll have to take a call of your faith. Okay. And the next page, on page number 330, here says, it may be noted that the fame of the Janakas of Videha, both before and after the Bharata war, rests more on their patronage of learning, culture, philosophy, and spiritual attainment than on their martial exploits or sacrifices. Kings of Videha usually maintained friendly relations with neighboring states and used and formed matrimonial alliances with different contemporary ruling families. Okay, so the Janakas of Videha, okay, they were largely focused on learning, culture, philosophy, and spiritual attainment. That is what this civilization has been about. Now, at the same time, I'm not denying the martial component of the civilization, but if not less, then both these components are at par with each other, the martial component and the rest, that is learning, culture, philosophy, and spirituality. Okay, now these two are equal, if one is not less than the other. All right. According to on page number 331, according to the Puranic account, during different periods in its history, Kasi came under the sway of three successive powers of northern Bharat: the Pauravas, the Ikshvakus, and the kings of Magadh. In the interval between the decline of Vatsa and the rise of Kosala, Kasi appears to have enjoyed independence under its famous king Brahmadatta, who conquered Kosal possibly about a century and a half more before Buddha's time. Okay, so yes, these kings, they were largely I would say, largely competing to take over these centers. And do you think it's a coincidence that these centers are spiritual, like hub of spirituality for the Aryan faith as we know it today? Okay, Kashi, it's the center. Ayodhya, yes, it's a center. Ujjain, yes, it's a center. So all these places for which these kingdoms or these lineages were fighting, do you think it's a coincidence that they were centers of spirituality for the Aryanhood? There has to have been some explanation for it. They cannot just simply fight because they wanted to fight for that particular piece of land. There has to have been a stronger motivation underneath. Do you think it's a coincidence that these centers today are centers of widespread worship? Okay, Ujjain, we all know that. Kashi, Banaras, obviously, we all know that. So, all these kings were fighting for these territories for some reason. And that reason has to have been very strong for them to go out in the field and risk their lives for it. Again, that is something for you to think about and ponder about. All right. Next up, there is one big paragraph that I want to focus on right now in this video that is very interesting. Okay, R.C. Majumdar on page number 332, he writes, okay, Anga seems to have been on terms of hostility all along with its neighboring states of Magad and at one time included parts of Magad, as would appear from the mention of Rajgriha as a city of Anga. The Anga suzerainty would also be evident from the defeat of King Bhatia of Magad by King Brahmadatta of Anga. But the Anga kingdom lost its independence when Bimbisara, son of Bhatia, avenged his father's defeat and killed the Anga king Brahmadatta, annexed the capital Champa and continued thereby as viceroy till he left for Rajgriha on his father's death. Bimbisara later converted Anga into a separate province and appointed his son Ajatashatru as governor with headquarters at Champa. It is said that the Anga kingdom that lies towards the east, largely the territories of current day Bangladesh, West Bengal, and parts of Jharkhand, they were the territories that were under the ruling of the Anga kingdom. Okay, the character of Karna from the epic of Mahabharata was a king from those lands. Now it has been mentioned in the Puranas that these kingdoms have had an history of always being in a state of perpetual war with the other kingdoms such as Magad and all the other kingdoms. Okay. Now this is one of the reasons why it has been imagined that they would be different from the Aryan rulers of the West, meaning since they were continuously fighting, okay, the rulers in this area that we today call as Bangladesh, West Bengal, Jharkhand and Bihar, certain areas of these lands, since they were perpetually in a state of war with the kingdoms of Magad and all the other kingdoms, this has been used as a reason to determine that they were somehow different from the Aryans of the West. Okay, I would say this claim, it sounds very absurd to me because maybe they were employing the tactics of the smart war, meaning let them overtake these spiritual centers of Ujjain and Ayodhya and Kashi. Okay, once they overtake them, we will defeat them and overtake everything altogether. This could also be one of the reasons. But yes, due to the perpetual state of war between Anga and all the other kingdoms of the West, it is assumed that they might be different and hence they might be non-Aryans. Okay, might be. And this is all based on the hypothesis. So yes, this is how it has, the arguments are made that there was no political unity amongst different kingdoms of Bharat. But like I have already brought this out in the open, that since they were fighting for the spiritual centers, So that was one single point of unity between all these kingdoms who were, you know, internally definitely they were rivals. Okay, they were fighting for these centers. But the reason why they were fighting for those centers is one, this is the politically uniting factor, that they were fighting for cosmic order, that is dharma, and the spirituality that springs out of that cosmic order. All right. So that is the conclusion of this chapter. Next, we move on to chapter number 16, that is language and literature. Yes, and the language of the Rig Samhita is Sanskrit. Okay, not the Sanskrit as we know it today. It is, not completely, but largely different from largely different from the Sanskrit that we learn today. Okay. Now here, R.C. Majumdar, he frequently brackets the Sanskrit language in the bracket of Indo-Aryan languages. Okay. Now, Indo-Aryan language was an invented definition by the West to stake claim to the Aryanhood. We've already discussed this, so I'm not going to call it an Indo-Aryan language. I'm simply going to call it an Aryan language. Okay, Sanskrit was and is an Aryan language. Okay, so the language of Rig Samhita was Sanskrit. It has been tacitly assumed that Sanskrit, which possesses a few spirants, gives the truest picture of Indo-Europeanism, but that is, at best, an unproved hypothesis. Okay, you see how cunning and how manipulative the Westerners were. All they had to do was declare Sanskrit and the same bracket as the European languages, and hence they could stake a claim to the Aryanhood. Okay, so yes, that has been only given reason, and that reason is, since there are some scattered similarities between these languages, hence they had to have been come out from a single unity. Okay, I'll explain this with the help of Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant was a philosopher that has influenced the philosophy of the West to a large extent. Okay, he says there is this one sense of reason, universal reasons, that exists universally, across all people. Now, to demonstrate that, to explain that, how shall I do that? Yes. So let's say there is a big fire over here. Okay, and I ask you to keep your hand on that fire. Okay, so it would not need a special set of principles for you to know that that fire is harmful for you. Okay, same is the reason for me. Okay, I would not need a special knowledge for me to figure out that that fire is bad for me. We both will know at the same time that keeping our hand on fire is harmful for us. Why? Because there is a universal sense of reason that exists between us. That is something that is common all across human race. The sense of reason. That is what Immanuel Kant explains in his books and in his theories. Okay. So since there is this universal sense of reason, there are bound to be some commonalities between independent inventions that have come up in different civilizations and in different parts of the world. Language in a way is an invention. Okay, so if these languages that have been invented independently by the civilizations, so by Immanuel Kant's logic, they are bound to have some commonalities. Why? Because the sense of reason is universal. They had to have some similarities. Okay, so that reason can't be used that there are some commonalities between Sanskrit and some of the European languages, and hence it had to have, they can be clubbed together in one single bracket. That is an absolute absurdity, I would say. Okay. Next up, there is deep analysis of language in this chapter of language and literature, that is chapter number 16. So, for all the language experts, you can refer to this book. But from what I have been able to gather as a layman from this book, I'm going to share it with you in this video. Okay. The verb generally used in the Rig Samhita to express the art of versification is taksh. which literally means to hew. Just as a carpenter, by applying the art of his trade, constructs beautiful pieces of furniture, so does the poet Karu manufactures beautiful verses and hymns with which to win the favor of the gods, either for himself or more frequently for his patron. Okay, so imagine there is a carpenter, and a carpenter has blocks of wood. Okay, so that carpenter will use his carpentry skills, okay, on those blocks of wood to come up with some spectacular pieces of furniture. All right. Similar was the situation of Sanskrit language during the time of the Rig Samhita. Okay, the Sanskrit language was the building blocks. Okay, now the scholars in those times, they used these building blocks to come up with certain hymns. All right, and those are the ones who would have constructed, mechanically manufactured these hymns. Okay, now again this requires a lot of trial and error. It's not like randomly one in particular individual wakes up one day and starts uttering these hymns as if the heavenly spirits speaks to him. That's not how it works. Okay, these individuals, after centuries of trial and error, perfected certain hymns, and those hymns for centuries and centuries were oral traditions. And later finally somebody decided that this has to be written down for for the future generations to come, because this is invaluable knowledge for humanity. And hence, after I would say millennia and millennia, somebody finally gets this thought that we need to write this down. We need to put this down into writing. Okay, and I'll prove that in the upcoming part of this video. Okay, so verse making became a recognized profession. Okay, so just as a painter paints a painting, just as a craftsman produces crafts, okay, hymn making established itself as a profession. There were people who used to learn this language, and they used to craft and mechanically manufacture these hymns. Okay, so verse making already became a recognized profession in the Rigvedic age, and also that this profession had become a monopoly of the priestly class. The Rig Samhita poetry attained an amazing degree of technical perfection. Do you think this was coincident? Do you think this was random? Do you think this was achieved? This level of perfection was achieved, let's say by a hard work of 1 year or 2 year? No, this is centuries and centuries of trial and error. Okay, so yeah, this is how the science of making verses. Now largely these hymns were used used as a means of prayer. Okay, this is again a thought experiment for you. What would have been the motivation behind these people to manufacture these hymns? Okay, why would they manufacture these hymns? What was the motive? Okay, somebody might say, okay, worship might have been the motive for them to craft these hymns out of the Sanskrit language. That could have been. Okay, whom exactly were they worshipping? Because the time that we are talking about did not exactly have idols, did not exactly have the something to worship. So what exactly were they worshipping? Okay, the answer lies in spirituality. There, like we said, there is this quote from the Rig Samhita that I forget right now, but the quote largely translates as "You are the center of universe. Everything, Tattvamasi, if I'm not wrong, meaning everything is inside you. The entire universe is inside you." So those hymns were crafted in a way to alter your neural patterns, your thinking patterns, to resonate with the cosmos or the universe that is inside of you. That was the motivation behind crafting those hymns. Okay, that is the reason why we have schools in Europe that have started Sanskrit chanting in their morning assembly prayers, because such chanting reprograms your neural thinking patterns, and it starts resonating with your inner cosmos. Okay, you don't have to take my word for it, you can look it up on the internet. Okay, Next up is language. This is pretty interesting. On page number 339, R.C. Majumdar, he mentions, in a passage often repeated in the Brahmanas, it is said that the Asuras suffered defeat at the hands of the god because they mispronounced the words Araya as Alaya. This would suggest that the later Vedic age or the later Aryan age, when the word Asura had lost its original meaning and became a general term, the propensity of the Easterners to pronounce L for R was noticed and frowned upon by the Orthodox Aryans. Okay, now Aryans were very sensitive towards the use of their language. You will see current real life manifestations of this as well. If you go down south, okay, they are very sensitive with the use of language. They will apologize if they make some mistake. If, let's say, for example, if somebody is speaking in Tamil, okay, Tamil is a national identity. Tamil is a national language, I would say. I mean, I say national language, I don't mean to say it as that it is spoken all across this geography of Bharat. It should be, but what I'm saying is Tamil has a lot of scriptures, has a lot of knowledge that is written in that language that is still remains to be translated and disseminated all across this geography of Bharat, because the antiquity of that language is way old. Okay, but more about that in some other videos. What I'm trying to tell you right now is the sensitivity towards the use of language. These are the real life manifestations. Now, millennia ago, the Aryans, they were very much sensitive towards the use of language. They would wage wars on people who would not speak their languages properly. Okay. Now, there are some names of the authors also mentioned. I remember, the Prime Minister, the current Prime Minister, that is Modi, he went outside, I guess it was in United States, in one of the interviews and interactions with the diaspora. He mentions that nobody exactly knows who wrote the Rig Samhitas or all the Vedas. But in this book, R.C. Majumdar writes, okay, now like I have mentioned, the Rig Samhita is mentioned in the form of mandalas. Mandalas are largely chapters. Okay. So here on page number 340, R.C. Majumdar mentions that the Kanvas, the reputed authors of the first and the 8 mandalas, seem to have intentionally avoided using certain forms. The Vashishthas, the authors of the 7th mandala, show a similar aversion to absolutives. Okay. So largely these are the names of the authors of the mandalas, the chapters. Alright, so it's yes indeed, the recognition and attribution for the Rig Samhita and the knowledge of Rig Samhita exists. Okay. The language of the earlier mandalas was already in danger of being misunderstood when the hymns of the 10th mandala were being composed. Okay. So there is also some degree of variation in the type of Sanskrit that is used in the different mandalas. So what does it exactly say about you? Like we have mentioned a little while ago, okay, before actually being written down, okay, these hymns were an oral tradition. And before it was established into an oral tradition, prior to that, there was centuries of trial and error for perfecting those hymns. Okay, so we don't exactly know what is the span of time, what is the interval of time between each hymn, and hence you will see there is some degree of variation between the type of Sanskrit in the different mandalas. Okay. Here on next page, he comes up with the same argument. R.C. Majumdar, he writes, the fact, however, is that the text tradition of the Rig Samhita was stabilized at a comparatively late date and fixed in writing at a much later epoch. Okay, epoch. When you speak about time in geography, you don't speak in years or centuries. You talk in millennia and epochs. Okay. So here he says, before being fixed into writing, how many years prior to that was the oral tradition? And before even the oral tradition, how many epochs prior to that were the centuries of trial and error? Okay. In short, the text of the Rig Samhita is handed down to us in various details, not only different from what it actually was, but to some extent also screens the differences that mark off the language of the earlier mandalas from that of the 10th. Okay, so this variation in the language in the same book itself speaks, okay, that we cannot conclusively determine when exactly did these things come into play. Okay. On the next page, R.C. Majumdar writes, the language of the 10th mandala represents a distinctly later stage of Rigvedic language, which is frequent in the earlier Rig Samhita, is already in process of elimination. Okay, language. Okay. So for yes, you can imagine and visualize the time scale. If there is a difference in language, okay, how long would it have taken for that change to crystallize, for it to show up in language? Okay. All right, that's it for this episode of Ancient History of Bharat. In the next episode, we'll focus on the same chapter, but we'll focus on the literature of the Rig Samhita. Right. Thank you for watching.